I have three burning questions that have been burning my soul since I played Immortality.
It's an eternal flame. That's all
Yeah,
very thematic.
an eternal flame. Um, okay, so the first question, the first thing I want to know from you, let me just check my notes here so I don't forget. Because I believe I said this to you before, that Immortality doesn't strike me as the kind of project that sprouts from a big idea, more from seeds of ideas that germinate and then grow
Hmm.
into concepts.
Yeah,
And the
you're on the
way
right
I
track there. Yeah, a lot of people like
yeah,
so. So, what was the inspiration for Immortality? And people want that kind of clean, simple idea of like, oh yeah, no. One day I sat down and said, this is exactly what we're going to make. Whereas, yeah, generally there's just lots of stuff that.
from my perspective, playing it, I felt no, this wasn't a big idea. This was many seeds that were planted throughout the project, the whole development um, of the project. So, what questions were you asking yourself along the creative process for Immortality? How did these seeds germinate along the process?
Um, so I think one of the initial kind of very uh, silly or contrary things was having made like her story and telling lies and have people describe them as interactive movies would always be weird to me, right? Because as someone that loves movies, I'd be like, well, these are not movies, and the things that the what makes movies special, we're actually kind of pushing against that almost. I think actually, Telling Lies, the front page of the script said an anti-movie, right? So the pacing of it, the structure of it is not like a movie. So I'd always be like, oh, it's weird that people call these things interactive movies because they're really not. Uh, so there was a perverse thing of like, well, okay, what happens if we do explicitly go make some like what is a different interpretation of the word interactive movie, right? Because it's commonly understood to be essentially a kind of choose your own adventure thing. So it's like, well, what are more interesting ways of making a movie interactive? Um, so there was that, and with that as this kind of very crude premise, uh, I've always been really interested in like lost media, lost movies, unfinished
Mm.
movies that never came out, and there's just like one shot in a magazine, and it's so evocative because you're like, oh my god, what would this movie have been like? Half of Orson Welles' late movies were never finished. So many kind of it's such an interesting little exercise. Um, so there was that as an idea, and so at some point as well, I've been thinking about how a lot of my favorite filmmakers growing up were extremely over the top. Um, People like Ken Russell, Nick Rogue, Peter Greenaway, and a popular criticism of them would be that they're indulgent, they're too much. Right, Ken
Mm.
Russell. This movie is just too over the top. It's too much. But although to me, I'd rather that than there not be enough there, right? So, but and looking at games, I was like, there aren't that many games where people give themselves the permission to be indulgent, right, or to push something in a certain direction that feels like this is somebody really just kind of going for it with something that interests them. Maybe I don't know, probably Kojima.
Yeah.
There's probably a couple like Kojima's maybe one that kind of sometimes gets away with that.
Hey there, sorry for the Metal Gear Alert jump scare, but I had to insert an addendum here as I'm editing the audio. Something that I didn't say when I was chatting with Sam because I didn't want to break his train of thought, but I've been reflecting a lot on what he says about indulgence. Because if you think about it, there are as many people unwilling to give themselves permission to be indulgent as there are people who would call them pretentious if they did give themselves permission to indulge. Why do we think so? Why is it such a sin for someone to indulge, especially in regards to art? And to stretch my point even further here, thinking on historical, cultural perspective, this is very much a Western thing, right? As we've inherited the very concept of indulgence from Catholicism. At the same time, I wonder if this is why Japanese devs give themselves more permission to be indulgent. We see a lot of experimental, crazy, over the top games in Japan coming from Japan. And I just recalled a perfect example of this, the Japanese action game from the PS3, El Shaddai. I guess it came out back in 2012, 2011. And I remember reading a review of it calling it artsy nonsense. And I'm not saying this isn't a valid opinion. I guess what I'm trying to say is that sometimes it's just too easy to judge stuff on the basis of pretentiousness or self indulgence. And it's interesting to be mindful of that. And I realized I just self indulgently went off on a long tangent. Okay, let's get back to Sam.
So there also with Immortality was this idea of like, let's be really silly and ambitious. So this kind of idea then started forming of making a game about 3 lost movies. Just like, that sounds very ambitious to make 3 entire lost movies. And then you're sort of thinking about, well, what are we exploring with this game? And it's like, well, we're really digging into questions of why we tell stories, why people make movies, what is involved in making movies. These are all like very big questions. So then it was like, okay, well, it's exciting to give ourselves permission to be indulgent and be over the top. So that kind of became a big part of it as well, of just kind of having, not holding back and having this grand idea for a video game. And yeah, once I remember actually when we were making Telling Lies, it was really uncomfortable at points because we were making a game that was about real world politics, and we were writing it and then shooting it during like the Trump presidency, when everything and like people were talking about the FBI as maybe the FBI going to save us from Trump. And I was then making this game about how the FBI are evil, and then we constantly kept bumping up against the real world politics, because we'd be saying, well, we have these characters that are protesters in the modern day. They would be talking about Trump, and we're like, oh, do we like, is Trump president in our game? Do we just, do we ignore it? And it was really hard because we knew that like the game would come out in 2 years and it would be impossible for us to be current, and the world might have changed in such direction. So starting Immortality with some of these loose ideas, I was like, oh, it's going to be really cool to just make a game without politics in it, that is just, oh, aren't movies great and rich and interesting? But the second we started kind of putting the story together and doing our research, and we're like, okay, so this is taking place in the 20th century. We're looking at the history of movie making. There are these interesting shifts where you go from the studio movies to the new Hollywood of the 70s. Then you have like this burst at the end of the 90s, which is a kind of reappraisal of that. Like fairly early on, we were like, well, the character that this can revolve around, if this is an actress who is cast in her first movie, feels like all of the questions we're asking about what is the sacrifice involved in making art, who gets to put their name on it, who is the storyteller, gets very dramatized and is very concrete in this character. And then we started speaking to people from the time, doing our research, and immediately you're like, okay, there is a lot of politics here. you talk about being an actress in the 20th century, you're bringing all of that stuff in. So then the themes start to get more complicated, and there are kind of more interesting touchstones.
Well,
yeah.
art is intrinsically political. We can't
Yes.
separate politics from art. As much as people would like to, certain people would like to. We can't separate.
I think the really dumb thing that I see constantly in games, and it's mostly coming, I think, from the big publishers, is the idea that a political game should be a kind of weighing up of things, right? So I remember there was a Far Cry game that was set in America, and they were like, well, we're going to show both sides. We'll have the left and we'll have the right. And, you know, the game will allow you to see these different viewpoints. And certainly, like, when I made Telling Lies, I was like, this is a political game, not because it's condescending and stupidly saying, here are all the possible viewpoints, let's figure it out together. Telling Lies intrinsically has as its premise that the FBI is bad, and that there comes a certain amount of kind of government overreach which becomes morally wrong. Like, that's the starting point of the game, and it's political because it's saying, what is the effect of that truth on people, right? What is it like to be a human living under this system? What do these different power structures mean? How do people deal with that? Is there a way through that? You know, so to me, that's what a political game is. And, you know, when I think of a political movie, I'm not thinking of a movie that is, again, you know, saying let's balance this equation of these different viewpoints. A political movie is a movie that takes a political truth and then explores the ramifications of it, right? And kind of exposes that. So yeah, there seems to be a real, and I don't know if it's just decision makers and marketing people, like a real reluctance to even like own an opinion about politics in a game, right? You know, Far Cry cannot have a take on America in the 21st century. It's just going to let the player come up with a take by just, you know, dropping all these just objective facts.
I believe that was Far Cry 5. Let me just check here. Just a sec. Far Cry 5. Yeah. It was set in America. Yes, I know. I haven't played it.
They definitely have
I
their
know.
cake and eat it of being like, hey, we're going to tackle these big ideas, right? That's what makes this game different. But then at least, I don't know, I guess we'll see what GTA 6 has to say. But I guess, the GTA games do occasionally wimp out by being kind of equal opportunities, just like we're going to be cynical about everything.
You talked about political movies. Can you cite one that you really like?
Yeah, let me think of, I mean, for Telling Lies, we talked about The Conversation is the Francis Ford Coppola one, which I could be getting this completely wrong, but did it predate Watergate or came after Watergate? I'm not sure.
I think it was after.
Okay, yeah, so it was kind of reacting to all that. But yeah, that's like a great
74.
movie where you have this protagonist who is part of the system, right? He's just the engineer almost. He's the guy that does the wiretapping, and he's doing it for government and for business, and you know, so he's not making any moral choices, right? He's just doing the really good job of doing some really good wiretapping, and he becomes obsessed with this one recording. And you know, by the end of the movie, spoilers, like he's been destroyed, and you know, his worldview has kind of been slowly stripped apart, and he realizes that, you know, he can't trust anyone, and that's like such a great you know, encapsulation of that moment where you know, America was realizing that their institutions could not, you know, to the highest level, could not be trusted, right? And these new technologies were kind of erasing their right to privacy. That's a really good one. This one I've been watching a lot for a new project, so that's maybe a future spoiler. Is Peter Greenaway's The Cook, the Thief, his wife and her lover. It's a movie I went back to because it feels quite hard to exist in the current world and not just be constantly angry about everything, right? And it's like, how do you respond to that? And even like when I made Telling Lies, I didn't want it to be like misery porn, and so we kind of made an effort to carve out some non-sad endings for the three characters who are kind of the victims in that story, it was like, well, can we show that they're survivors and give them some strength so that there is, this is not just a bleak experience. But now I feel like the world is in a state where it can be very cathartic to just be extremely angry. And that Peter Greenaway movie, when I rewatched it initially, for the first hour or so, it's like, oh my God, this movie is so horrible, like literally horrible. And the characters, the Michael Gambon character is so nasty and horrible. And he is like the most perfect encapsulation of that kind of 80s greed. And I was like, this movie is just so horrible to sit through. Maybe this isn't a good movie. But by the end of it, I kind of pushed through that, and it gives you some catharsis. But there was something incredibly kind of cathartic and comforting to sit there and be like, yeah, this movie is not pulling its punches. It is calling out these people as being as absolutely awful as they are, and it's slightly healing to kind of sit in something as intense as that and kind of feel. They're not balancing anything out. They're not holding back the kind of primal scream that is a fair response to these kinds of systems. And it's interesting because we are now living in a world that is the fruit of that kind of initial 80s economic model of the Reagan era economics. Like we are really on the other end of that, having really fully come to fruition. So that was, that's a political movie that is not characters sat around talking about politics, and it's not really foregrounding the themes in so much as it is just making a big kind of operatic nightmare out of them. So that's that's one that I recommend if people have the stomach for it. It's also very beautiful. It helps. It's very beautiful. It's got Jean-Paul Gaultier designed all the costumes, some really beautiful costumes and kind of production design. It's got an incredible Michael Nyman score that is great. Helen Mirren is fantastic in it.
She was so beautiful back then. She's wearing like a black outfit with straps.
Yeah, that's one of the Jean-Paul Gaultier dresses.
Mm-hmm. So moving on to the second question, the second burning question, and this one is really burning my soul. But before I get into it, Halata Molin, if you're watching this, so I've read a lot of interesting interpretations about the one and the other one.
Mm-hmm.
People seem to go all over the place with them. But to me, they feel a little bit more abstract. So what I want to ask you is to elaborate a bit on the symbolism of the ones and also the symbolism of fire. Spoilers, if you didn't play the game, it's the only way you can kill the ones. Fire is historically a symbol of destruction, but also of creation, of spirit, the fire of Prometheus. So can you elaborate a bit on the ones?
Someone that works for me had a friend play Immortality recently, and they came in and told them all their thoughts, and then they saw like a video explainer or whatever explaining like this is exactly what's happening with these characters, and they were like, oh, I had like more of a thematic interpretation or a metaphorical interpretation. I must have got it wrong. And I was like, well, no interpretation is wrong, so let's start with that. But I mean, for me, I am like the essence for me of a story is kind of like characters and themes, and sometimes like the question of like, well, what is really happening, or what exactly is the kind of the scientific fact of what's happening in this story. Even going back to like her story, and people would which was a surprise to me, people got really into the question of like what's really going on in that story, and they had a couple of different explanations. And for me, it was like, I'm not that married to what the literal interpretation is, because for me, the essence of the character is a very pure thing, and that engages with the theme directly. So if you're playing her story and you're thinking about a sense of identity and self and what it means to have different identities that are put on you and that you have internally, like this is the stuff that I'm interested in. And so with Immortality, it's like if we were thinking, it's almost like dialing everything up to 11 in terms of if we're asking questions about what it is to tell stories, to write, to be an actor. Like even as a writer, you're inventing characters that are kind of an expression of yourself, but they're also, a costume that you're wearing, and it's a way of living multiple lives in your head. It's a way of trying to get inside the head of another human being. So kind of thinking about all those processes and going, well, okay, well, here's a character that is literally that. And like a thing, someone asked me why do I like horror? Why do I like the horror genre? And a thing I like about the horror genre is you can take a concept that can be quite kind of abstract or metaphorical, and you know, in the most obvious horror movies, you create a monster, right? So you create Freddy Krueger as a manifestation of these ideas, the guilt of the parents and all these things manifesting. But very quickly in those movies, you kind of forget about that metaphor, and it just becomes literal. It becomes it's just Freddy Krueger, and so it almost it allows you to bypass some of the kind of more pretentious aspects, or you're not constantly relating everything back to the theme. You're just kind of reacting sort of intuitively and emotionally to it. So yeah, for me, creating a character who is the most concrete sort of literal version of a lot of these questions. Here is a character who has a lifespan and life experience that vastly outweighs any normal human being, but they're jealous because that means that they don't have quite the same necessity that human beings do to try and deal with their mortality, to try and project and create things outside of themselves. So you have this character who is has an abundance of sensory information and experience, but is jealous of the idea of trying to create the perfect story and kind of manifest that. And I was, so before I went indie, I worked on a Legacy of Kain game for 3 years, which got cancelled. And as part of the writing of that, me and the co-writer, we were kind of tasked up front with, this Legacy of Kain is a vampire series. And at the time, I think the publisher was kind of worried because Twilight had come out, and they were like, "Oh, has Twilight made vampires not cool anymore?" By not cool, they meant, has Twilight made vampires something for teenage girls, not teenage boys? So they were like, "You have to come up with, a cool take on vampires." So we went and read like all the vampire books, or all the good ones, or supposedly good ones. Watched all the vampire movies, and really wanted to find the interesting versions of vampires and takes on that. And so when that game got cancelled and I came away from it, I had all of this vampire research in my head that was just sat percolating in the background. So to some extent, when I had some of the initial ideas for Immortality, it was like, okay, this is a vampire story in many ways, right? We have this character that has this really long lifespan, lives alongside humans in some kind of parasitic way. There's the kind of the natural sex appeal of a vampire, which has a lot of analogies with that of a movie star, right? And the movie star has the glamour that they can turn on when they're on screen, and then when they step away, it kind of fades. So there's this kind of supernatural, magical kind of sense to being a movie star. So that was very, very much kind of in the forefront with how this character would play out. And it was a chance to I think that the most interesting thing with those characters to me was the question that you sometimes ask when you're kind of analyzing your story is the why now, right? Like, why is this story happening now? Why is this the most interesting time for this story to happen? And the really interesting thing for me was to think about if you have a character that's interested in the history of storytelling, interested in storytelling as a general thing, and in the background that if they've been around since year zero, and they've seen the biblical storytelling, and they've seen the ways that the stories that humans tell, and they've tried to influence them. There is this huge sea change when you hit the 20th century with technology. The difference in how stories are told and how they affect society. It's this huge leap. There's a really good, maybe my favorite vampire book called the Vampire Tapestry by getting her name right. I think Susie McKee Charnas. Is that? I might just invented that name. The book is called The Vampire Tapestry, and
The Vampire Tapestry.
And it has this idea of vampires as being beings that hibernate, and the protagonist in it makes the point that for the entirety of human history, this vampire character could just go off and hibernate, wake up after 100 years, wander on down, and the settlements would be kind of where they were, and they would be able to blend in and figure things out. But the idea of going to sleep in the 19th century and waking up in the 20th century would be just like suddenly the rate of change and technological advances would be, like waking into an entirely different universe. And I felt like there was something similar here with movies. So the idea of a character that has this natural, somewhat supernatural charisma, is really interested in storytelling, suddenly discovering movie making and the ways in which you can communicate through the capturing of real life on film. So you have this character that allows you to kind of really verbalize just how fucking cool movies are, and what a magical idea it is if you stop and think about it. So that was kind of really interesting to me, was that having a character that has such a big perspective that they can really kind of dial into what's so magical about movies, that this is something that's going to just blow them away and pull them in. So you kind of simultaneously with Marissa have kind of the naivety that is externally expressed because she is at the start of the story, the story of the game, this young actress with what people assume is no world experience, fresh faced, but also has, on the flip side, this very deep soul, and actually, which again is that kind of duality that you get in a lot of actors who are projecting a certain role. There was a very, very early on my mood board for Immortality, there was a interview which is, you'll be able to find online, it's kind of fun. It was Olivia Hussey and her co-star in the 1968 Romeo and Juliet being interviewed by, I don't know if it was the BBC, but it was like a British, very kind of stuffy British interviewer. And at the time, I think she was like 15 or 16. And she's giving this interview and she's smoking throughout the whole interview. And there's a point where the interviewer is like, "Oh, Olivia, I couldn't help but notice you're smoking. There can't be many 15-year-old girls who are smoking like this." And she just gives him this killer look like, dude, you have no idea what teenage girls are up to. I remember watching that clip, and I was like, there's something about this guy and his assumptions and the way he was treating these two young actors. And there was something like real wish fulfillment of like, because that look she's giving him, like if behind that look is this old vampire that could rip his head off, like that feels like a good kind of that there is some of that energy is already present in this scenario, and we're just dialing it up a little bit. All of these different ideas of kind of supernatural beings that show up to encourage storytellers or encourage humanity generally. I think like the interesting tweak for us was the idea that the being behind Marissa is in awe of what the humans are making, right? And it's like I want to figure out how you're doing this, and I want to be good at this. And really, like the story of the game is coming up against the frustration and the difficulty of actually telling a good story, which was like that was, I think, plugged into a lot of these ideas, and then I guess leads to the fire was if you reduce the idea of making a movie to it's an immortality project, right? I'm making a piece of art that will live beyond me as a way of dealing with my mortality, as a way of kind of creating something bigger than me. And if that is the drive that pushes a lot of creatives to make these things, well, then you look at, on the most extreme end, people who are working themselves to death, who are kind of risking everything to make these things. And there's something very perverse there about trying to almost kill yourself to make an immortality project. And the literal example that was one of our mood board picks was when Stanley Kubrick made Eyes Wide Shut. This was a movie he'd been trying to make for his entire career. Like as soon as he got a start in the 60s, he had this book that he wanted to adapt, and he tried and tried and tried. There was a version that almost happened with Woody Allen as the lead character, not Tom Cruise. There was a Steve Martin version. He had all sorts of famous writers. I think John le Carre wrote a screenplay. Like he just kept coming back to this idea. And so when he finally made Eyes Wide Shut, it was, so this was like a lifetime ambition. And then Kubrick literally died before the movie was finished. Like it was not 100% finished edit. And he was found dead. And in the making of the movie, he was exhausting himself. He was an older man at this point, and his wife would come out of the house in the morning, and he would be asleep on the path where the taxi would have dropped him off, and he would have been so tired he would have fallen asleep before he got to the front door. So yeah, we're thinking a lot about that. And as a creative, like the cliche is that when you finish something, you're never happy with the thing you made. And the only way to keep going is to then think about the next thing. Well, I'll get it right next time. The next thing I make will be perfect. So it's interesting to give the character the opportunity to try and become more human in putting these things, but then realize this is the curse, right? That I get trapped, the limitations of the flesh, and the challenge to you can never create the perfect thing, which so then leads like the big ending, or at least chronologically the big ending. I think that was in there quite early on, was this idea that one of the examples I would go back to. So I was like obsessed in writing this with Gene Seberg, whose story makes me want to cry whenever I think about it. Like super tragic. She was cast as, I think she was, I want to say 16, cast at a very young age, wanted nothing more than to be an actress, to act, to learn how to act. Was cast in the Joan of Arc movie. Otto Preminger, who cast her from thousands and thousands of applicants, had no interest in teaching her how to act. He, was very controlling, and it was a very uncomfortable experience for her. She then goes on to do Breathless, which is iconic, but then struggles for the rest of her career. Has some really, really, really sucky relationships, and then kind of dies tragically. And so yeah, that was a crystallization of like the disappointment inherent in choosing this life, and there was so much kind of sadness in that. But you then get into the thing where you're like, well, to some extent, Jean Seberg lives on, and her star power lives beyond her. And the one that was an even more a stronger example for me was Rita Hayworth. So like the story of Rita Hayworth is like a lot of that studio era. It's kind of semi-horrific in that she was this Latina woman, what's her name? I want to say Margarita Cancino, I think was her name. And at some point she gets picked by the studios, and she goes through a process where they changed her hairline using, very painful cosmetics. They lightened her skin using very painful 1940s or 50s cosmetic procedures. Changed her name, obviously, gave her the name Rita Hayworth, basically rebuilt her. So, took her identity from her, right? And her agency and all those decisions are being made by a bunch of dudes who are running the studios. She has, her directors, writers telling her what to do, and everyone's trying to sleep with her. And she was never super, super happy, right? She has the famous line of people would go to bed. Her big movie was Gilda, right? She would say people would go to bed with Gilda and they'd wake up with me, and they would always be disappointed. And for me, looking at her movies, you're like, well, although she's very famous and iconic film star, she wasn't in that many great movies. And not many of Rita Hayworth's movies continue to be kind of in the popular culture in the same way some movies do. Even like Gilda, it's like an okay movie. Lady from Shanghai is like not Orson Welles' best. But it's almost like Rita Hayworth herself lives on beyond that. Like there's something inherent to her, which you could call star power or whatever, the magnetism. Like she lives, the images that were captured of her live on in a way that no one remembers who directed Gilda. I mean, some people will, but like, that isn't who we're talking about. We're talking about Rita Hayworth as this concept. So there's something like interesting about how in death she kind of outlived all the other people that were kind of arranging these things, and it there was some power in that. It makes it easier for us to think of it as less of a sad story if you look back and have this perspective. So there was the idea that the realization that the Marissa character has in failing to create the perfect story is that there is something about being captured on film that inherently can be transporting. And so this kind of idea that dying on camera is, has its own magical power. And I think inherent to the project early on was the idea that the kind of rationale of the game is that this is an experience that has been created to transmit Marissa into people's brains, and that through the act of playing the game, obsessing over it, watching all the footage of Marissa, discovering that final footage, you're inherently bringing her back to life. and she's going to live on inside your brain, and yeah, which can be metaphorical or it can be literal. My 13-year-old the other day pointed out to me that all my stories have similar endings, that there's always some big sacrifice or some big cathartic death. Like telling lies, part of the story ends in a guy blowing himself up. Yeah, her story, there's an implied off-screen kind of big dramatic sacrifice. This stuff I'm working on at the moment has some elements, and the kid was listening and they were like, "Dad, why does this always happen in your games?" But I don't know, that to me is, to get to the point where the character confronts non-existence, or in a positive or negative way, seems like really taking the story all the way and kind of taking the audience with you. I noted, actually, I can't say this out loud. I was going to spoil another game.
No, please.
Not one of my games, though. I don't want to spoil someone else's game. There was another game that came out at the same time as Immortality, and they both had the same trick, which was all of the marketing materials and box art was full of all this fire imagery, which you watch and maybe you just like, oh, it's cool, it's a cool visual, it's abstract, and then by the time you actually get to the end of this story, you're like, oh no, that was hardcore foreshadowing for where this story is going. I like that kind of in plain sight stuff.
This thing of sacrifice, because if we think about it, Margarita died so Rita could live.
It's such a harsh story. Like Lady of Shanghai was a movie that they made after her and Orson Welles had broken up, and there was I'm going to get all my names wrong here. I'm going to say Harry Cohen was the studio head, and so you had Orson Welles, the ex-husband, now director of Rita, and then you had the studio head who essentially owns Rita Hayworth. And Orson Welles decided to cut her hair and dye it for that movie, which is thread. There's a thread in Immortality, and there's threads in all of our research around hair and people controlling actresses through their hair. But Harry Cohen was furious with Orson Welles because he was like, "What the hell have you done to her iconic Rita Hayworth hair, right? That we own, that we designed." And so you had these two guys of varying degrees of control and ownership of Rita Hayworth arguing about who gets to fuck with her hair. And Rita Hayworth's there like, I'm thinking that Jane Fonda was the one that we had. Like Gene Seberg was the sad story, but around the same time Jane Fonda is coming up, so similar ages, that Gene and Jane, and obviously Jane Fonda had a little bit of a leg up in her family, but that was also not a great start because there was a lot of tragedy in her family. But the Jane Fonda story really kicks off, and it again all comes down to hair, when she is in a relationship with Roger Vadim, who's the director of Barbarella, and is doing, he's the boss of Jane Fonda. And Barbarella is him going, I'm going to turn you into a sex object and show the world that this woman that is mine is this incredible sex object. And he has this whole thing of like the blonde hair, long blonde hair, and at the time Jane Fonda was telling herself that this was all part of the sexual liberation. Like as a modern woman, she was happily in having lots of group sex and being this kind of embodiment of the sex object for herself, not because that's what Roger Vadim wanted. At some point, she started to have a different interpretation on that and be like, actually, maybe I was playing the role that he wanted. But the big break happened when she went to do the movie Clute. It was like a big moment for her. I can't remember if she had left Vadim or was leaving Vadim. And prior to the movie Clute, she went in to a hairdresser's in the East Village, I think, or somewhere in New York, and had the iconic Clute haircut, where they cut it short, and it was this kind of little brown, super iconic hairdo, which was the final straw for the dean. He was like, "Oh my God, what have you done? You've gone and styled your hair in the way that you wanted to style it, and it's not how I think it should look." And then when she filmed Clute, which is an amazing movie, she took on this role of playing this sex worker, and she was kind of unsure of whether she could do that, if she could do justice to, or make it a feminist role, or if it would be come off bad. But there's all these sequences in the movie where her character Bree is talking to a therapist, and none of those scenes is in the original script. It was all stuff that Jane Fonda came up with, and it's literally, if you watch it, it's Jane Fonda talking about herself, trying to get a handle on how she's been living, her concept as herself, as an actress, as a sex object. Super cool. But yeah, that was always that was the other kind of one of our touchstones, was kind of Jane Fonda being the version that did get to take some control and did get to kind of live her life. I remember my mum bought me the diaries of Catherine Deneuve, which was she makes like very detailed diaries on all the movies she shoots, and she published some of the diaries. And this she kind of excises all of the personal stuff, so she doesn't talk about. It's kind of weird because you know that going on is relationships with people, but she doesn't talk about it, so it's kind of this weird negative space. But there's this thread through it of, as she's writing her diary, she like writes what she eats on a given day, and it's so crazy. It's like, oh, today I ate an egg, right? Or I had a slice of apple, and blah, blah. It's that level of like physical I don't know, dedication is kind of crazy.
Before I go into the next question, just taking it back to the vampire theme, you talked about how vampires are metaphorically, how it connects with movie stardom. And I remember, did you read Anne Rice's novels when you were researching vampire lore?
Yes, I think I went back and I read the first one.
Interview with the Vampire.
Yeah.
But it reminded me of the Vampire Lestat, where she actually makes Lestat a rock star.
Yeah. So many vampire stories. There are a lot of, when you look at top 10 vampire books, top 10 vampire movies, a lot of the ones that are supposed to be really good, I bounce off of, but so many of them don't, for even a minute, think about what it would mean to be alive for like more than 100 years. Right? Like you not have, most vampires just kind of, cheesy vampires in an action movie, they just kind of act like decadent rich people, right? Which seems like you would get bored of that. I don't know. If you meet someone that's been alive for hundreds of years, they would in theory be extremely educated, but then obviously they've been educated in the ideas of the past. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I think the Anne Rice novels, definitely you get a more interesting take on the personality and soul. And the Charlize Theron movie on Netflix, which I think was called Immortals or something like this. So I was like, oh shit, because I think it came out just before Immortality, and it was mostly just an action movie, but there was one good bit in it where they give the Charlize Theron character, who in theory has been alive for thousands of years, I think they give her like some Turkish delight to eat, and she tastes it, and she can tell them where all the different spices came from, right? Because she's got such a developed palate because she's been alive for so long and eaten so many things. And I was like, okay, that's kind of slightly interesting that they would have this extra kind of sensory kind of appreciation.
Yeah. It reminded me of a movie with Tom Hiddleston and Tilda Swinton, a vampire movie.
Only Lovers Left Alive.
Yeah, it's also in this vein. It's really interesting, and it's the thing with Anne Rice, because she translates the vampire hunger, the craving for blood, as a craving for life, as a craving for creation. So Lestat becomes a rock star.
There's a series of stories as well that it gets nicely knotted, but Orson Welles tried to adapt, I think, some of them, and they didn't. None of these happened. But the writer Karen Blixen, who Orson Welles said was second only to Shakespeare in his estimation, but she's most famous for the novel, which I think is semi-biographical, Out of Africa. But she wrote, is Karen Blixen her pen name? She has like two names. One of them's the pen name, but she wrote a lot of Gothic short stories. There's like 7 Gothic tales, I think is the famous one. And she wrote a series about this opera singer, I think called Pellegrino. And essentially the story there is this beautiful opera singer, and she's somewhat timeless. And there's a character, I think, in one of the stories who's like in love with her. And then there's kind of this frame story of all these different people that were in love with her. And the story there essentially is that she is a vampire, but her thing is singing and performing, and she and being adored, and she will come along and have this moment, and then she will disappear and take on a new identity somewhere else. And this one guy, I think, and this is told over multiple short stories, so I can't remember, there's different angles on it, but yeah, there's like one guy who digs into it and discovers this truth to her, and he comes across all these other guys who kind of worship her from afar and are sort of happy to bask in her glory, knowing that that she is going to outlive them and there's something more powerful than them. But that was another one where I was like, okay, this is like the interesting twist. There's also Ellen Datlow. She edits every year. She edits like a lot of short story collections and magazines, especially in horror and fantasy. And every year she does the best of horror, which is like 20 of the best horror short stories. But she did a collection. Let me get the name right. One of them is the first one called, I think maybe it's called Whisper of Blood, or Blood Is Not Enough. But it was a collection of unconventional vampire short stories that was really good, where she was like, okay, there's more to vampires than just the literal crucifix, garlic, holy water, blood, right? So there was this beautiful collection of short stories of different interpretations of vampirism and what it means, that I remember reading that and being like, oh, this is good. Like, this is actually engaging with some of these ideas. There's a really good, one of my favorite short stories ever in that collection, called The Sea Was Wet as Wet Could Be, which is it's so good. I think I'm going to say Garn Wilson wrote it. And it literally just takes, I think I put this, I have Marissa Marcel read the original section from Lewis Carroll, partly as a homage to this, but it takes the story of the carpenter and the walrus from Lewis Carroll, where they trick the oysters to come along with them for a lovely lunch, and obviously they're going to eat the oysters. And it's like such a dark, perverse story in Lewis Carroll anyway. And this short story takes it and kind of reframes it to a bunch of kind of bad I think they're Californians. It's like a group of friends having a party on the beach, and they're all kind of slightly jaded and slightly not dramatically damaged human beings hanging out on the beach. And these two characters show up that remind the narrator of the walrus and the carpenter, because one has like a big mustache or something. And it ends as kind of bloodily as you would imagine, but it's such a cool, creepy little short story.
You almost answered my last question. But
I'm very good at these
and then
concise little answers. Very. I just get straight to the subject, answer it cleanly, 2 or 3 sentences, and then I'm done.
but that's why I love you. Because you bring so many references to the interview. It's so rich. The last question, last but not least, was what does immortality means to you as a person, existentially, philosophically, the concept of immortality?
So I think interestingly, someone did ask me for some podcast, like, what's your meaning? What's the message of immortality? And I was like, oh, it's not. I don't want to say what the message is, but the thing that I felt like a discovery that I think some of the talent and stuff also kind of discovered as we're doing it was when we were structuring the game, to kind of help organize things and also to drive some of the music, I kind of called out if we have this question, which is how do human beings deal with their mortality? We had 3 answers that the game was kind of illustrating. One of the answers was essentially religion, which was the idea that there is an abstract kind of afterlife beyond death, and you can kind of sense it in this life through ritual, through prayer, etc. Right? That's one way in which people have coped, and that's sort of, at least historically, for the longest time, that was like a big part of how people dealt with how bad life is. And then the third answer we had was the idea of the Immortality Project. Was, oh, well, human beings deal with their mortality by creating things that live beyond them, by participating in structures or schemes that are bigger than one person, right? Whether that's creating an organization or building cathedrals, or whether that is writing a novel that is going to stick around after you're dead, right? That was like our third answer. Then the middle answer was one answer to how do you deal with mortality was to essentially negate it, was to live in the moment, was just being present and enjoying being physically present in the moment, and whether that's through dance or sex or food or music or whatever, or just being aware of everything around you. And that kind of, at least in our structure, was sort of the hypothesis of the 70s section. Was like, you're in New York, it's the 70s, we're kind of post-sexual revolution, there is fluidity of gender and people's sexual identities. The new Hollywood is, taking things out of the studio, letting people tell stories that are more personal. There is a kind of excitement to it. And definitely, like, in making the game, and I know that, like, this was Manon's take as well of the character, was like, oh no, this is the best, like, this is the happiest Marissa is when she's around in the 70s. And doing all the research, I'm like, oh shit, man, I would love to have hung out around this time, and been hanging around with Warhol and his crew, and just all these interesting people that were kind of floating in and out of New York. And and definitely, I think from from the 2020s, where we're like, oh shit, like, stuff's broken, everything sucks. Certainly for me, growing up as a child of the 80s, so similar age to you, it was definitely a narrative that we had, certainly in the UK, of like, things are always getting better. Technology is improving our lives. There is a raising of living standards. So, my parents' generation grew up where they had toilets outside. Now we all have plumbed toilets inside our houses, right? My parents grew up coming from a long line of working class people. My dad was the first to go to college, and now the rising middle class in the UK. This idea that we are all, things were always getting better, and that things are becoming more liberal and progressive. And now, you look around and go, oh shit, like in America, they're taking away abortion rights. Oh God, like things, the internet is worse than it was 5 years ago. All these things that seemed cool and not as good. And so it really definitely feels like you go back to the 70s and the spirit. And obviously there was a lot of, there's a lot that sucked about that time, but it really feels like after the 70s, you hit the commercialism of the 80s and Reagan. So it definitely felt for us going back, revisiting that time, it's like, oh, there was something kind of special and nice here. And so that was, I think my vibes takeaway was, and that is, I guess, the kind of more depressing kind of arc of Immortality is that Marissa Marcel fails to make her perfect movie, and discovers the limitations of her flesh. But I think realizing that, the Immortality Project is not the end goal, not to get too pretentious, but like when I have some friends that are novelists, and like sometimes you'll kind of have like the discussion of what is the point, or if you have a choice of what medium to work in or what project to work on, like how are you making that choice, right? So I have friends that write novels, and so in a certain way, a novel is the purest form of expression, right? Although there are, it's not as simple as people think. There are editors and processes and stuff, but ultimately you're sat there and you're writing directly to your audience, putting yourself on the page. But the audience, unless you're the next Harry Potter, the audience can be quite small, writing a book. And I was working on a project with one writer, and it was this video game, actually the one that got cancelled. And we were aware that we were making kind of compromises because there was a big publisher, and they were, telling us that you have to have this much combat, and we have to do X, Y, Z to satisfy the mass audience. And we were doing our hardest to make this a weird, strange thing. Anyway, but we were like, well, is it better to go and write the book that is 100% you, that has a real intimate connection with the audience, and have a small audience? How does that compare to making a big budget video game that has an audience of millions but is diluted somewhat? And then with video games, you got into the weird question of just how quickly the work dates, right? So like my last Silent Hill game is one of the better games I've made. It was on the Wii. Very hard to actually get that game and play it now. And even if you do go to the trouble of getting all the tech and finding a disc or finding it on the internet or whatever, you can't really appreciate that game in the same way because the graphics have dated so much. And so what that game looked like in 2009, you can't really kind of revisit that. So we were like, well, if you write a book, even post-apocalypse, if there's a hardcover version of it, someone could find it on a shelf somewhere. But if we're making this video game, this game will die very quickly. But so then you're like, well, is it better to have a big audience in the moment? And I think there comes a certain point with some amount of maturing where you're like, really that question of the legacy and longevity feels more childish. I guess it's where you look at, I don't want to diss the guy, but I'm sure he's fine. But like Quentin Tarantino with his very public obsession with like his legacy, and wanting to create the perfect legacy and not make too many movies where overstays welcome. I don't know, that feels like quite a childish obsession to sit back and obsess over your own legacy. So I think, to some extent, in Immortality is the encapsulation of me deciding that you should just relax about these things and try and actually have genuine moments in the present.
A couple of weeks ago, I was reading this article on Games Radar where Many devs talked about games that made them fall in love with gaming, and you, not surprisingly, you cited a game that perhaps never existed. That I am a pretty decent digital Tomb Raider, and I found the game. I found an article from 1984, the year I was born. I'm turning 40 this year. So I want you to please tell us now, what is Adventure Island? How did it make you fall in love with gaming? And how did it shape your creativity as a storyteller and a game designer?
Yeah, this is like a funny question, right? Because they ask you, what was the game that made you fall in love with gaming? And then you read other people's answers, and it's like Call of Duty 4, and you're like, oh my god, I'm so old. Because this was not only like just a game. It was probably pretty much the first game I played. Right, this was in my school, and
Can I ask how old were you back then?
I would have been somewhere between 8 and 10, I think.
Oh,
We'd been living abroad, and we moved back to the UK to this very small school in the countryside, and it was so small. There was one girl, and she was the head teacher's daughter. But this head teacher was very eccentric, in like a good way. He was obsessed with D.H. Lawrence, who, as an 8-year-old, I didn't know anything about D.H. Lawrence, but I remember we went on a school trip to the birthplace of D.H. Lawrence, and now I look back and I'm like, what were my parents thinking, like sending all these kids to D.H. Lawrence's birthplace? But this teacher would tell us he'd be like, today we don't need to do any school stuff. You just go and play in the woods, right, and do stuff like that. But he would also sign up for any scheme, right? If there's anything free or any kind of new thing that he could get as a teacher. And so we were one of the first schools, I think, in the area that had a computer in the school. It was like a BBC. Like in the UK, I'm guessing it is. I've never really thought this through too much. I'm guessing it is associated with the BBC that does all the television. But there was basically this BBC computer, which was very much promoted as being for educational purposes, right? And so we had one in our school, and the game I remember playing on it. There were two. There's one called Granny's Garden, which a lot of people from the UK of a certain age remember, because it had, for its time, not in any level of sophistication, graphics, because a lot of games were text-based or very crude graphics. And this game, Granny's Garden, had a full screen picture of a witch who I believe was going to eat you or something. And that genuinely, terrified a whole generation of school kids. But the game that I remember was this game, Adventure Island, which, as you say, I've, at various points got on the internet being like, I must be able to find a copy of this game, right, that I remember. I must be able to find a disc image that I can go play. And sadly, it seems like none exist. But it was a game developed by what sounds like, from the research I did, like this cool company in Cambridge or something. And the premise was you were stranded on a desert island. I think you shipwrecked, you're capsized, and you have to figure out how to survive and escape. And it, from my memory, was like a really, somewhat detailed simulation of exploring this island, having to get drinking water, right? You would have to figure out how to sterilize the drinking water, find shelter. And the really cool thing was, because we only had one computer for the whole school, and it was still a relative novelty, you would get like one go on the computer a week, right? Maybe an hour or something would be your turn on the computer. So you'd get to sit and play this game, try some stuff out. I remember once being bitten by a snake and having to try and figure out how to deal with a snake bite. And because the internet didn't exist back then, like you didn't have Google. How do what should I do if I've been bitten by a snake?
How do I kill the snake?
You'd play your session, and then I'd spend the whole rest of the week just thinking about this game right? What am I going to do next? Imagining solutions, imagining what, or even, you know, going home and getting like my encyclopedia, I guess was the equivalent of the internet, and trying to figure out like, well, how should I deal with a snake bite? How should I, you know, get usable drinking water? So it was, you know, just as a game itself, like very cool in terms of the idea of the open exploration. I mean, you think of like Minecraft and then the whole genre of survival sims. This was that, right? Like we weren't chopping trees down to get blocks of wood to make chairs, but it was that kind of vibe of like being somewhat open, of the harsh survival conditions and stuff. So there was that, which was, you know, in itself really compelling. But there was definitely this thing of going home and playing the game in my head. The gameplay back then was think of the solution, then A, does the game support the solution, and then B, how on earth do I express this? You know, exactly what do I have to type to get it to work? But yeah, that, you know, now if I look back and I think, well, you know, now I'm primarily focused on and excited about giving people freedom. I've been kind of playing with ideas of how can you give more over to the player's imagination? How do you create, you know, have the story be something that's occurring in people's heads, you know, rather than just be the action on screen. So this was, you know, that seed was definitely planted by this early experience. Who knows, if I had Space Invaders instead, maybe I'd gone in a completely different direction.